southeastern Massachusetts. Estimated at 750,000 people, or 11% of Massachusetts' total population, it is a rapidly growing community deriving off of positive economics and excessive tourism. From the historic town of Plymouth, Cape Cod with its popular sandy beaches, and the islands of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, people constantly take advantage of this majestic environment, whether by vacationing during the summer months or permanently residing in the increasing amount of suburbs. With this increase in population density in southeastern Massachusetts, many people may not be aware of the rare and unique ecosystem that may be present just outside of their doorsteps. This ecosystem is referred to as the Greater Pine Barrens, which is made up of over 20 natural communities in 26 local towns. Ranging from the dense forest of Miles Standish to the more rugged shrubbery of the pitch pine and scrub oak, from the hundreds of miles of shoreline across the Cape to the open waters of Nantucket Sound, the Greater Pine Barrens is a rare, biodiverse ecosystem that must be protected by the community. To take on this challenge, nonprofit organizations and other individuals have risen to the challenge of both protecting and preserving the Greater Pine Barrens. In this film, we look at 15 different organizations and individuals who have volunteered countless hours of dedication into making sure the Greater Pine Barrens is protected from destruction and deforestation. Whether it's informing the public, opening new reservations, promoting green burials, caring for injured wild animals, burning invasive flora, or simply protecting fragile ecosystems, these 15 groups or individuals work to keep the world's largest remaining Atlantic coastal pine barrens flourishing and teeming with wondrous wildlife. To start off, we look at the Southeastern Massachusetts Pine Barrens Alliance, located in Plymouth, Massachusetts. We learn from Cheryl Heller, president and the founder of the Pine Barrens Alliance, and Frank Mond, a creative writer and journalist, the goals of not just their own organization, but the goals of the entire Pine Barrens Partnership that are composed of the many different local environmental organizations.
The Regional Conservation Partnership is a very loose network of the various agencies and entities who are conservation stakeholders within this very unique ecoregion. It encompasses all types of organizations, everything from federal government down to nonprofits and businesses. This Pine Barrens Partnership started in 2015 and is called the Southeastern Massachusetts Coastal Pine Barrens Partnership. It involves everything from South Duxbury through Plymouth County, Cape Cod, and the islands.
It's an area that has various identities, but we want to convince people of that important identity of the ecosystem, the Massachusetts Coastal Pine Barrens. The second largest Atlantic coastal pine barrens in the world happens to be here, and we can celebrate that and bring about awareness of its existence and what that means.
Pine Barrens Partnership is guided by a steering committee of 9 members from groups like Manomet Center for Conservation Sciences, Mass Audubon, the Cape Cod Commission, DCR Forestry.
Our own Southeastern Massachusetts Pine Barren Alliance.
Of course, in the Pine Barrens Alliance. They direct our activities, and Frank and myself and a few other people serve as facilitators carrying out the programs under the direction of the steering committee. The Pine Barrens Partnership is, as we said, a loose network of conservation organizations. Our goal is to raise awareness of all of the good work that is being done in this ecoregion by the various conservation groups. Everything from airport management to seabird protection to Friends of Miles Standish that work on trails and try to keep sustainable trails and activities in the Miles Standish State Forest. There's a huge variety of conservation organizations. So our goal is to highlight and promote and then bring those voices together to enrich and enlighten the whole community as to the amazing and wonderful natural resources we have within this Pine Barrens. Right now we have several programs in the works. We've just been awarded a U.S. Forest Service landscape scale restoration grant, which will entail 9 different projects throughout this ecoregion. We're extremely excited to be starting that program. It will also involve the town of Plymouth. We're doing a restoration here in the town forest lands, removing red pine plantations and letting them recover and become pine barrens once again.
We also have the Cox Foundation grant for what we're calling Where Do You Love, where people in the community, people that live in this ecosystem, identify those places for whatever reason that they have affection for, that are dear to them. A lot of them are natural, and some of them are their homes. Could be the place down the street where they have a delicious lobster roll. But we're trying to show how there's a connection between where people actually love and appreciate and how the natural ecosystem contributes to that ability, that quality of life. But we're beginning with where people love, and so we have these beautiful maps, and they have little hearts all over them where people have identified those special places.
And what's really cool about this project is when people place a heart pin in a real map, that information is transferred online into an interactive map, and then the viewer can click on that heart and read about that spot and why it was selected as a Where Do You Love spot.
Also see, hopefully, a lot of pictures of that spot that are given to us by the person that chose it, as well as potentially video as well. So in a lot of ways, it's kind of a viral thing that people realize that where they love, whatever their scientific or environmental background is, if they have none at all, they can have the same sort of level of appreciation and share that.
And then all these 4 layers will be combined on a conservation vision map, and then those areas of highest interest will be selected and proposed as potential conservation areas. And then we hope to bring the whole entire ecoregion community together and agree and sanction this map as the conservation vision for the region. So it's a big project, but we feel it's incredibly important if we're going to save these coastal pine barrens in southeastern Massachusetts. If you would like more information on any of these topics, you can go to the Pine Barrens Partnership website at www.pinebarrenspartnership.org and find links to any of the topics here on this video. The coastal pine barrens really is an overarching umbrella term for what are 40 natural communities, at least 40 natural communities within the ecoregion. And every one of those natural communities has an associated group of plants and animals dependent on that type of habitat. If we don't save every one of those communities, we will lose species that are within and require those associations. So it's important that each one of those types of natural habitats has a representation, a large enough quantity, and connected to other habitats that support and enhance it if we're going to be able to save biodiversity in this ecoregion.
They're all like a set of dominoes. They're all leaning against each other. When one goes, it's very, very difficult to keep the rest upright, if not impossible. So that's kind of a part of our mission as well, to keep all those natural communities upright and vital.
As we continue our journey across the town of Plymouth, we hear from Dory Stolley, Coordinator and Outreach Manager for the Watershed Action Alliance of Southeastern Massachusetts. The 12 local watershed organizations work together across the area to ensure clean and plentiful water for both the people and the wildlife in a place where there is a high occurrence of water bodies.
Hi, I'm Dory Stolley, Coordinator for Watershed Action Alliance of Southeastern Massachusetts. We're an affiliation of 12 local watershed organizations that work for clean, plentiful, and free-flowing water in rivers, the ocean, in our ponds, for people and for wildlife. One of the main issues in southeastern Massachusetts is polluted stormwater runoff, and we work for solutions to that issue as well as the problem of old or leaky septic systems and wastewater treatment plants. And the third issue of pollution, that's a big one, is over-fertilization of lawns. When that fertilizer is not taken up by the lawn, it ends up in our waterways, and that causes overabundant growth of weeds and algae, making a stagnant and a pond that's not good for wildlife. And if you've ever tried to swim in one, it's really not good for that either. So Watershed Action Alliance is involved in figuring out how much water there is, how we should divide it up, where it should go, and how we can conserve it as well, especially during times of drought. Therefore, water conservation is a big issue for many of our organizations. Not only can people in their homes conserve water, businesses can do it as well, and when you're watering your lawn, that's a time when water conservation should come into effect in the summer when there's not enough water to go around. Wildlife is going to need that water in the streams, and we have had, some of our organizations have had the streams in their area run dry and the fish just basically die there in the stream. But there are solutions that are fair and also give everyone, both human and animal, the water they need to survive and be healthy. We also need free-flowing water, especially the fish. River herring, for instance, breed upstream in fresh water and then spend most of the rest of their life in the salt water. So they need to be able to move up and downstream without barriers. So many of our organizations do dam removal and then river restoration. Once you get that water free-flowing again, you also cut down the problem of stagnation and making areas for mosquitoes to breed. And in these days with climate change and mosquitoes carrying a variety of different and new diseases, that's important as well. Watershed Action Alliance spends a lot of its time and effort on education. We educate legislators and other decision makers so that they understand what it is that their constituents want and need, what wildlife needs, and how to have a healthy community and environment, and what is needed to get there. So we really encourage people to look around and find out what is their local watershed organization and join it. Not only will they learn a lot about their local waters, how to keep them clean, but they'll also meet people who enjoy the same kind of recreation that they do and have an interest in their community. Now you can look up your watershed organization at our website, watershedaction.org, or check in with your town at Town Hall to see if they know, and they should, what your watershed organization is.
An example of one of the local watershed organizations is the Heron Pond Watershed Association here at Plymouth. These individuals most recently worked together to prevent a fragile 4,500-acre ecosystem in the Heron River watershed area from being developed. On July 21st, 2017, we witnessed the ribbon cutted for the David E. Alper Nature Preserve, which represented the hard work and dedication done by this group, along with the collaboration and cooperation with the local government. Before the ceremony, we spoke to Bill Cohan about the Community Preservation Act and Lee Polis about their successes in the Heron Pond Watershed Association.
My name is Bill Cohan. I'm the chairman of the Community Preservation Committee for the town of Plymouth, which manages the Community Preservation Act. The Community Preservation Act is a statute, a Mass General Law, that the town of Plymouth adopted on May 11, 2002, and it allows the town to have a surcharge of 1.5% on a quarterly tax bill here in Plymouth. So the residential property tax has a 1.5 surcharge. Those revenues that come in are dedicated to housing, historical and open space acquisitions, restoration, and preservation. The committee makes recommendations to town meeting through an application process that we have developed over the years. And as a result, the town of Plymouth has been able to preserve over 2,000 acres of land, build 64 units of affordable housing, and preserve historical landmarks like our old library into a center for the arts. The old Methodist church in downtown Plymouth is now a center for the performing arts. Our 1820 courthouse is now our new town hall. These acquisitions build a sustainable local economy, by investing in our architectural resources, protecting our habitats and our water supply with open space acquisitions, our passive and active recreational acquisitions. They all benefit the town in form of a higher quality of life, a greater tourism result, and also creating affordable housing is an important part of providing housing for all demographics in the town of Plymouth. But this is an example at Little Herring Pond of the preservation efforts of our community and our residents in our town. Thank you.
The Herring Ponds Watershed Association in Plymouth and Bourne, Massachusetts was founded in 2007 by a group of residents to try to protect, be guardians, stewards of the state-designated area of critical environmental concern called the Herring River Watershed, ACEC. And so the group has grown over the years to about 250 members and friends that we mail quarterly newsletters to. And we have 3 or 4 public meetings a year. And we have produced a stewardship guide and distributed those to about 1,500 households free of charge to give people tips about what they can do to improve the water quality in the watershed by taking care of their own piece of property, not putting too much fertilizer on, maintaining their septic systems, and all the things, creating buffer zones along their pond shore and so forth. But in the process, we've also taken on some rather larger projects. So we have volunteers that count herring coming into the system in April and May. And we work with the state and the town biologists. We've done biological surveys and also invasive plant surveys with our volunteers providing the boats and guiding experts around the pond to do the analysis. So basically we're just a group of volunteers trying to preserve the environment for future generations in this 4,500 acre watershed that has 11 ponds and 2 rivers.
After looking at one of the successes that the Watershed Action Alliance made in the local community, we were able to witness Jack Jezard, a member of the Maths Lift AmeriCorps, representing the Southeastern Massachusetts Pine Barrens Alliance, give a speech on July 25, 2017 at the Wildlands Trust Building in Plymouth. In this speech, Jack outlines the basics of identifying what a natural community is made up of. The 3 general types of natural communities include a terrestrial ecosystem, one that is not significantly influenced by standing water, a palustrine ecosystem, one that contains freshwater wetlands, and an estuarine ecoregion that is affected by varying salinity, tidal actions, and wind. In terms of a forest, Jack pinpointed the levels of integrity one may hold. A high-integrity ecoregion, such as a pitch pine forest, contains open space and is not heavily dominated by a larger, generalist species. Meanwhile, a declining example would be a dense forest containing a more aggressive white pine, outcompeting smaller trees. While informing the general public on the basics of community identification, Jack's speech also intended to promote biodiversity and conservation of new land based off the knowledge presented to his guests. We next spoke to Paul Gregory on a recently restored area of Miles Standish State Forest, which can be classified as a high-integrity example of a natural community from Jack Jezard's presentation. The over 12,000 acres of protected land, as we learned from Paul, requires a lot of work and maintenance to ensure the health and stability of the flora and fauna. An example that Paul focuses on was the removal of the dying red pine trees due to an invasive insect to promote more open space and restore habitats to pine barrens.
So welcome to Miles Standish State Forest. My name is Paul Gregory. I work for the Department of Conservation Recreation as a management forester. What you see behind me is a recent project that restored the Pine Barrens. The Pine Barrens is typically an open community, open vegetation structure of pitch pine and scrub oak. The Pine Barrens is a globally rare natural community. Miles Standish is approximately about 12,000 acres. About half of Miles Standish is Pine Barrens habitat. The project behind me was previously was a red pine plantation. The red pine succumbed to the red pine scale, which is a tiny, minute insect. So for the project, the three main goals were to protect public safety, 2, to reduce wildfire danger, and 3, to restore the Pine Barrens habitat. Throughout the project, we found many charcoal pits that date back to the early to mid 1800s. From about the late 1700s to the mid 1800s, Miles Standish was a cut-over, burned-over forest used for charcoal production for the local iron industries. And one of the charcoal pits behind us is where the still remaining dead red pines are. We did not cut in those to keep the landscape as it was back then and to be preserved and not have any equipment go through those areas. And as the vegetation grows, we most likely will also burn these areas to maintain the Pine Barrens. Pine Barrens are not only a disturbance-dependent ecosystem, but also a fire-dependent ecosystem where the vegetation actually responds well to the prescribed fires and also keeps out unwanted vegetation as well. So the short-term goal was to restore native shrublands and woodlands. The long-term goal is to apply prescribed burning and or mowing to perpetuate the Pine Barrens. We use different frequencies, intensities throughout the Pine Barrens here at Miles Standish. And also we are also working on a fire management plan for Miles Standish. I should also mention Miles Standish, due to the Pine Barrens, has one of the highest number of endangered species here in Massachusetts. There is 42 recorded endangered species here in Miles Standish. Many of those are associated with the Pine Barrens, and many of those are rare moth and butterflies.
Headed down to Manomet, we spoke with Gloriana Davenport, who is the trustee of a 610-acre farm property known as Tidmarsh Farms. This particular area is quite unique. Formerly wetlands, it was developed as a cranberry farm beginning in the 1890s. Evan Shulman purchased the farm almost a century later in the 1980s and continued to operate it until 2010, when the Shulman family decided to take the land out of production and restore it to wetlands. The resultant return in nature has been such a success that Mass Audubon, an organization devoted to preserving and protecting nature, purchased the land and established the Tidmarsh Wildlife Sanctuary there in October 2017. Along with discussing the restoration, Gloriana also talks about the fascinating technology being developed through the partnership with Mass Audubon and Living Observatory that provides scientists and the public with a fascinating window into the arc of change across the property.
Hello, I'm Gloriana Davenport, president of Living Observatory and trustee for Tidmarsh Farms. Tidmarsh Farms is a large 610-acre property that was put together from 3 cranberry farms, the largest of which is the one we're on today, and the one that was recently restored in 2016. So the problem with cranberry farms, when you take them out of production, we took ours out of production in 2010, is that the farming practice puts about 2 feet of sand onto the property and straightens all the stream channels. So you have no hope for a shady, slow flow of the water off the property, which would be a typical stream channel scenario, nor do you have really the conditions of wetland, which would be a rich organic soil mix. You have this very poor sandy soil. So we formed Living Observatory to ask some of those questions about the impact of these restoration actions on the wetlands. or on the wetland trajectory, I should say, as we move forward out of cranberry farming into the future. So when we began to talk to Division of Ecological Restoration in Massachusetts about becoming the project manager for the restoration itself, we at the same time founded Living Observatory and went out and requested scientists and colleagues of mine at the MIT Media Lab if they would like to collaborate on doing a very interdisciplinary work of studying this restoration over time. And lo and behold, several of those scientists and engineers and artists decided to join us. So today we have about 10 faculty and a community of about 50 to 60 students and senior researchers who are interested in exploring how Tidmarsh Farm changes over time. We also grew Atlantic white cedars and planted them out in the restored wetland to try to reestablish that swampy habitat that is becoming rarer and rarer along the East Coast at Tidmarsh Farms. One of the fun projects we have is we talked to a colleague of mine at the MIT Media Lab who is interested in putting sensors everywhere and thinking about what would the sensor ecology be like if we were going to measure change over time at Tidmarsh Farms. Recently we put up a really fun wildlife cam in one of the rivers, the stream channels that was recut to record the wildlife there. And we have some great shots of heron who at one point found the lens of the camera and started attacking it even. Those shots are really wonderful because you're out in the middle of the restoration with no human activity around. You see the two heron that both populated, or you see a group of geese with their chicks. So you get to see how the land changes over time in a place where you can't be every day. Again, the idea of Living Observatory is to record over a long period of time the changes in many different aspects of this property, and then to be able to look back and comment on how the restoration really impacted the land. Can we really say that this is the best way to, the best approach when we take cranberry farms out of production to restoring some of our natural resources in a moment where we have the potentially very disconcerting effects of climate change.
Gloriana was also able to take us on a tour on some of the landscapes present at Tidmarsh Farms, which include various pods of plants and grasslands, a streamland habitat, and an area called Valentine Square.
This is the former reservoir. Unfortunately now it has a lot of algae on it. It's been very hot and there's a lot of algae coming off the headwaters area. So this is the new stream channel. You can see how sinuous the channel is. And you can see again the large pieces of wood that are doing two things. They're holding the bank and they're creating habitat for fish who want to stay in the cold water. They don't want to be in the warm, open water. So one of the fun things about this restoration is we've discovered some endangered and rare species that are occurring at Tidmarsh now and probably have occurred here for a long time, even when we were farming cranberries. One of them is the eastern box turtle, which is an all-time favorite. Other species that I had never seen before, have you ever seen a ring-necked snake? I love seeing different snakes. We also have a lot of different butterflies right now and moths. So we're headed down now to what we call Valentine Square. So this is the area of the restoration that we saved out and we leveled and made perfectly flat. And if you see all the stakes in the middle of it, those are marking individual plots where Kate Ballantyne and her colleague Todd Anderson put in different amounts of biochar. And they're going to measure how the soil responds to that biochar, because it just could be that a biochar amendment will help soils and restoration reestablish much faster than they would if it was just the natural trajectory with no addition of carbon. So there you have it. You have an MIT sensor out in this corner, and those are about to be replaced with sensors that will be measuring soil moisture very accurately over time, so we can understand how much moisture a particular plot has at any given time, and we can chart that through the years and through the months.
Our last stop at Plymouth was at Nelson Park, where we met Lisa Meeks and Paul Anderson, two beach ambassadors. The beach ambassadors are a group of local volunteers who educate the public about the coastal environment, especially the wildlife. Their longest running program is at Nelson Park, where they spotlight a nesting osprey family in the nearby marsh.
Welcome to Nelson Park here in Plymouth, Massachusetts. We're the beach ambassadors, and we come up here weekends, Fridays and Saturdays and Mondays, Tuesdays, and we have a good time working with people that show up and have questions about the beach, and one of our big projects has to do with osprey. Lisa.
Thank you, Paul. We primarily come out here and we watch the osprey. Osprey are a relatively common bird we have, but we like the osprey because osprey are what are considered to be an indicator species. They tell us what's going on in the environment, and we're fortunate here that we've got a nice big osprey here that makes it easy for us to watch the osprey. These birds arrived back from South America the end of March, and we believe about 2 weeks later the eggs were laid, and we're thinking that maybe about the end of May. And here's a replica of the actual osprey egg. And it is a replica, so nobody worry, it is just a replica. So we think about maybe towards the late May, the eggs hatched, and here we are, less than 2 months later, and these young birds are actually flying. Now, we say they're an indicator species because the osprey eat fish. Fish live in water. Back in the 50s, 70s, the osprey were in danger of basically going extinct because a pesticide was getting in the water. It was getting into the fish, and they were eating the fish, and it was affecting their egg production. Well, once the pesticide was removed from the water, removed from the environment, the osprey are alive and well. So we've got a nest here down at Nelson Park. We've got one down at Long Beach. If you go to Ellisville Harbor, there's another osprey nest. They are all over. And these are amazing birds. The adults will stand about 2 feet tall with a 5-foot wingspan, and they will migrate all the way to South America. So pretty neat birds. So Paul and I and our colleagues will be out here, and we'll watch them as they grow, and we encourage people to come out and watch them with us. And we just basically talk about the osprey, the environment, and the beautiful beach we're in. So a lot of fun.
We have a shell display. We have activities like a search for different shells and beach things that the kids can look at, and coloring sheets. And there's a lot of activities that we can do with the children as well. And so we welcome people to come 11 o'clock to 2 o'clock each Friday here at Nelson Park.
And we've got little binoculars for the children, so if they can't look through the spotting scopes, and the kids look at them, and the kids really like to look at the birds, especially when we tell them that the birds are the same size they are. So it's really a lot of fun. So it's great to have the osprey here. It lets us know that things are doing well in Plymouth. We've got nice clean water, we've got plenty of fish, the osprey happy, and the osprey will be here until about the end of August. Mom will take off, Dad will take off, and then one by one the juveniles will take off. And we will not see these osprey next year. They will come back the following year. Interesting thing about ospreys is ospreys mate for life. But if one of them does not show up again the next spring, the other one goes off and finds a new mate. We know that this male is not the same male from last year. This male has a band on his leg. Last year's male didn't have a band on his leg, and we know that this male is 4 years old, and he was banded in Duxbury in 2013. So this could be one of his first families, so kind of exciting. I mean, this might be his first family here in Plymouth, so kind of neat.
As we begin our transition onto Cape Cod and learn about its environmental organizations, we stopped by Falmouth, Massachusetts, located on the southwestern side of Cape Cod. Falmouth is home to the 300 Committee Land Trust, which had recently been working on habitat restoration projects. The example that Alex Zolo, Stewardship Coordinator of the 300 Committee, discusses about is the Brivogel Conservation Area. In 2001, the town of Falmouth acquired this conservation area, which had previously been a sand mine. The seller donated a decent amount of land to be restored rather than developed, and the 300 Committee took on this challenge. Alex will talk about the construction of 5 vernal pools in the area used to promote habitat and species growth, along with implementing sandplain and grasslands into the area.
Hi, I'm Alex Zolo, and we are out here at the Brivogel Conservation Area. It's 67 acres of now conservation land that was previously a sand mine. You can see it's a pretty sandy area. And when it was mined for sand, the previous owner, Carl Brivogel, he wanted to sell this parcel to the town with the idea of restoration. So it had plans for a subdivision. They could have put in, it was over 60 homes, but instead he chose to preserve it in perpetuity through the town and a conservation restriction which is held by the 300 Committee. And he left some money for restoration purposes. So we're out here today, kind of midway through the project. About a year ago, we underwent construction and we had a D6 dozer out here, and we were able to dig down into the water table and create 5 different vernal pools on this site, totaling about a 3-acre area, specifically for ephemeral wetlands. So when we created these pools, we saved some of the sedges that were present in the area and we replanted them. So along the edge of this pool you can see some thicker clumps, and those were planted at the time of the restoration. We also, with the help of the Conservation Department from the town and several volunteers, were able to seed this entire area with a native wet mix that we got from New England wetland plants. And we seeded an upland area of 15 acres with a sandplain grassland mix of native seeds. Historically, vernal pools have been subject to development because depending on the year or the time of year that you're at them, you might not even notice that it's a wetland. Without looking at the soils, it's easy to come across a vernal pool in the woods and not even know that it's a vernal pool if you're there during the dry seasons. So we've lost a lot of habitat for salamanders, frogs, dragonflies. We've lost a lot of that habitat to development. So these vernal pools specifically were constructed to indeed be vernal and go dry every year, which means that species like bullfrogs or fish cannot inhabit them. That allows some of the smaller frogs and other species to be able to make it to maturity. If these pools were wet, say year-round, they would invite species like bullfrogs that would then eat them. So it's providing habitat for a different species set. What's so crucial about this property is the linkage. We are next to open space on almost all sides. We have 70 acres that was just preserved called the Shallow Pond Woodland, which directly abuts this. We have an Atlantic white cedar swamp on town property, and we have the town leaf dump. So we have over 150 continuous acres that are not going to be developed. So we think that this would be a great spot for species like eastern spadefoot toads. Going forward, some of the management tasks that we will have to take on include replacing this fence, which comes down frequently in high wind events. There is a Phragmites stand that's coming up in the pool area that we will have to treat and cut back. We will have to use herbicides to do that. We've manually removed as much as we can up to this point. I think the key to the overall success of this parcel is going to be engaging as many different groups as possible. We've had help from the Boy Scouts with invasive removal. We've had help from AmeriCorps with creating a bird viewing area and helping build kestrel boxes. The 300 committee has been able to create a section of volunteers called their wildlife stewards, and we've had volunteers out here monitoring our kestrel boxes and some of the other plant species that are present. We've partnered with the Botany Club of Cape Cod. We've had loads of people out here, and that's what we want. We want people to come out, enjoy the parcel, and contribute as they can to the maintenance of it in the future, but also really just benefit from being outside in a quiet space. Again, I think measuring success depends on which specific goal you're looking at. So we've had a lot of successes and we have a long way to go. We've been able to successfully have kestrels breed here. This was our second season. We've had killdeer use the parcel. We've had several species of toads. We've had a lot of species using it so far, but when really trying to measure the success, I don't know that you can ever say, oh, we succeeded, we're done, and we can walk away. I think it's going to be a long-term project where there's going to be active oversight, and we're going to have to continually measure and document what's here to know what successes we've had.
The Waquoit Bay National Estuarine Reserve is also located in the Falmouth community on the Cape. The mission of the reserve is to promote science-based decision-making that leads to healthy coastal ecosystems, whether through protecting the local environment or educating the public. We spoke to Jim Rassman, stewardship coordinator of the organization, on the importance of studying soundscapes in order to improve the environment. We also toured various locations on protected land, which serve as key examples for natural soundscapes.
We're standing at the head of Waquoit Bay here. It's what's behind me. My name's Jim Rossman. I work for the Waquoit Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, and I would like to talk to you a little bit today about soundscapes, the concept of soundscapes. All of us are familiar with landscapes, landscape paintings. It's what our eyes are seeing, and we tend to be eye-driven species. We tend to use our eyes a lot, and that also reflects how we go out and experience the world. Often we're experiencing with our eyes, but we forget our other senses that are just as important, equally important. And one of those is our ears, or how we hear the world, or how sounds affect us. And so the concept of soundscapes is exactly, instead of looking at the world through your eyes, you're looking at it through your ears. And so we would like to do some work on soundscapes here at the reserve. And that means going out and recording the natural and man-made environment, and then using that data, because it's really a strong data stream that you get back, to interpret changes that are happening on the landscape, human effects on the natural environment, how the soundscape affects us as a species, how sounds affect other species like breeding birds and breeding mammals, and also again, how the landscape is changing out there, and what soundscapes, just like we can lose a landscape, we can also lose a natural soundscape. So a soundscape is made up of three general things: geophony, which is the natural sounds, the sounds of ocean waves, the sounds of wind in the trees, those natural sounds that have been with us since the dawn of time. Biophony, the sounds of animals minus humans, so bird song, animal calls. And then anthrophony, the sounds that the human landscape is making, people talking, alarms going off, all those sounds that we've brought onto the environment, and many of those are driven now and increasing now through our technologies. And the project we'd like to get funded would be to start working across the country with other research reserves and placing recording devices out in environments, man-made and natural environments on the reserve here, and trying to capture a baseline data of the soundscapes. That's one valuable use. Introduce the concept of soundscapes into our educational environments and our public relations environments by playing sounds in our visitor center or on the internet, on our website, issues like that. Another important use that we feel like of the sounds that we can record is just as a recording of get a handle on what the background species that are out there using our reserve are. So just identifying, using sounds to identify breeding birds, breeding mammals, creatures that are out in the environment and how they're using our habitats. A third use would be when we actually do management. So many times we're managing habitats for specific wildlife goals, and it's sometimes difficult to realize if you've reached those goals or not, and soundscapes are a relatively cheap and easy way to record a change. And finally, it's just, again, building that baseline data so that we can look back over 5, 10, 20 years and see how have our soundscapes changed. We may be losing soundscapes that we didn't realize it without being able to look back in time. And then that, as a society, then we would have to decide, is that something that's concerning to us? Do we need to change how we're doing things? You know, what's the loss of that soundscape mean either to the wildlife that's out there or to us as a species? So at that point, I think what we can do is we can move through the natural environment and the man-made environment and pick up some sounds and point out some different sounds that we're here at the reserve headquarters. In a coastal environment, such as we're standing in right now, there's a lot of geophony going on, or a lot of natural sounds going on. So there's the sound of the wind coming across the water, moving through the leaves of the trees. Also, the waves slapping on the shore is a sound that you often associate with the ocean. It's a sound that people might play for themselves to help fall asleep. It just, sounds, those types of natural sounds really can be soothing to people. That's why those are used for that. But it's also a soundscape that often is masked now by human noise. Is another name for human caused sound that's actually irritating, right? So to be able to recognize these natural soundscapes and again how they interact with us and we interact with them. We do also pick up some bird noise here. I can hear some birds arguing in a tree behind me here. But if you're interested in hearing the sounds of the earth, a seascape is often a great place to go to get some of those more dramatic sounds and sounds you might not realize are missing in your life until you put yourself back in those environments. Standing here in a salt marsh, the soundscape will change significantly as you move from habitat to habitat. The soundscape will also change based on time of day and time of year. Behind us we see a typical New England salt marsh. You can hear some insect life in the marsh, you hear some birds overhead, but also more and more in these natural environments. We have Route 28, which is a major artery up and down Cape Cod, just through those trees over there. And that sound permeates this natural landscape pretty much 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So part of studying soundscapes is how the interaction between a natural environment and human sound, how that affects this natural environment and the animals living here, how it affects their breeding success, how it affects their use of the habitat. And again, though, it's also, as an aside, a great to just recognize how much of this is going on and either what natural landscapes, soundscapes we might be losing, or how we can modify our own, the way we live and the way we interact with technology to preserve some of these natural soundscapes so that we can interact with them and they'll be more supportive of the native species that would normally be using these areas. So here at the National Estuarine Research Reserve down at Waquoit Bay, it's a place with many different habitats, mainly think only of the coastal habitats that we're known for. But now we're sitting in a typical pitch pine forest. This area in this case hasn't experienced any wildfires recently, so you can see there's some white pine coming in, but it's typical what you'd see for southeastern Massachusetts. We've had to come quite a ways up this trail here before we can try to get into a more natural soundscape where we can escape some of the noises of the highway. And yet sitting here, in the background, I can still pick up the sounds of the road and the cars out there and a plane flying over every once in a while maybe. But so it is harder and harder nowadays in our developed landscape to really get back to what would have been the natural soundscape. But through areas like this and through conservation and restoration, I think the message is hopeful, both that we can restore the habitat, we can restore the species that New England is known for, and we can restore and appreciate not only the landscapes that we're working on, but the soundscapes that follow.
Our next stop is in Yarmouth, Massachusetts, in an area that has been burned by the Northeast Forest and Fire Management over the past several years. Joel Carson, owner and principal consultant of the company, has been involved with numerous fire management services across southeastern Massachusetts. Joel outlines 3 major burns that took place at this site in Yarmouth over the past 3 years, and he also pinpoints the significance of managing pine barrens environments through the use of contained fire.
So approximately about, I would say 9-10 years ago, Barnstable County and the town of Yarmouth approached me to conduct a prescribed burn here in Yarmouth, in the Yarmouth woodlands. Was following a fuel hazard reduction plan that we had done. And what you're seeing behind me is actually the first burn that was done here in town as a prescribed burn. Modern era prescribed burn is being a managed burn. We only burned about 1/10 of an acre, the first burn that we did. We were burning with relatively low humidities and low winds, fortunately. The low humidities increased fire behavior. The interesting thing about this burn is not only that it was the first burn in Yarmouth, prescribed burn in Yarmouth, but the fact that we had the fire department, the Department of Natural Resources, and the county money paying for this burn. To my surprise, at the end of the burn, we actually spent about 1.5 to 2 hours debriefing the burn. The fire department was highlighting how much they learned and how it was improving their understanding of wildland fire and was going to change the way that they fought wildfire. So I highlight this oftentimes in talks and when I speak with individuals or in briefings, debriefings after burns. I consider that one of the most successful burns that we ever did, even though it was 1/10 of an acre, because it brought the Natural Resource Program and the fire department together, got them talking the same type of lingo, same speak, and really made a game-changing direction change on where the fire department was going and how they viewed fire.
Alongside Joel, we spoke to Bill Benetti, Field Supervisor for the Division of Natural Resources in Yarmouth. Bill has helped to facilitate success of the burn program in the town by applying and receiving grant money from Barnstable County and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife for fire management.
We've had all positive feedback since we started this project. I was a little hesitant at first, to be honest, thinking that we'd field a lot of complaints. We had a few questions, of course, but once we educated them on what the program was about, we've had nothing but positive feedback. When you know, a lot of our residents use these trails daily, and when they see us working in here, they you know, they give us the space that we need to make sure that they're safe and we're safe, and they are basically applauding our efforts. They're very much on board with this project, which is great. Working for the town, that's a major factor for me.
We're looking at a unit that was done with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service New England Cottontail money. What we're looking at is a burn that took place fall of 2016. We're very fortunate in that fall burns can be a little bit finicky. Sometimes they're not the most clean burns, specifically don't burn off the most material. Sometimes they can be troublesome as far as burning in the ground. This one ended up pretty much hitting the perfect spot. It burned enough material, didn't burn too deep in the ground, but burned enough to get some great ecological work done. And again, it was done late fall, the drought index had lowered, and we were able to burn after actually a 50-year drought. We were able to burn that fall, and we had tremendous success. It left a lot of dead standing. It did burn deep into the duff around the pitch pines. There's a straw layer around pitch pine that builds up with the pine needles, and fire can burn deep and burn for months on end sometimes at the bottom of those trees in the fuels. And you'll be able to see, you can see that some of the root crowns are exposed. There's even some mineral soil exposed, which is very unusual for a single prescribed burn to occur. And we did top kill a lot of the vegetation. So the net results of this was really amazing. The follow-up activity was planned to do habitat management work, and we created some brush piles, girdled some trees with chainsaws, and also created drumming logs for wildlife to use. And it's unusual, we don't normally do that as part of our projects, but this particular project being U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service money for habitat, we were able to do it. And we're experimenting on this particular site to see if we can't create brush piles that will fit within the fire-adapted landscape here, which
brush piles can cause problems sometimes for future management, or they'll just burn down with the next burn that we do. And I think we may have come up with a way. Time will tell the next time we burn this. This particular area is an area that we're doing work with New England Cottontail U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service money here in Yarmouth for the Department of Natural Resources. The town was fortunate enough to get that money to do the work, and we were able to bring to bear some management tools that are extremely powerful to use here in the Pine Barrens. So oftentimes the treatment isn't complete until we come in and burn afterwards and burn that material off. Oftentimes we can skip the restoration phase and go directly into the maintenance phase if the conditions are right. And in the particular case of the unit behind us, we're almost achieving that maintenance phase. I would say as far as the structure of the stand and the species out there go, we are in the maintenance phase. As far as the fuel loading goes, I'd still like to see a little bit more burning of the woody debris on the ground to remove that, but we did remove the vast majority of it, which is great news. A few things that you may notice about the unit behind us, which was again masticated and burned, is you can see a lot of the browning. This particular burn took place 2.5 months ago, and you can see that we scorched a lot of the pitch pine trees. However, those pitch pine trees will resprout, and the vast majority of them will survive and do perfectly fine. We've actually engulfed trees completely in flames, burned all the vegetation off of them in the 30 years I've been doing this, and seen those trees survive. More importantly, what we are seeing are new disturbances coming in, which not only the old ones such as gypsy moths, which impact the oak and sometimes even the pitch pine, but southern pine beetle. And with regards to gypsy moth, one of the things that we were seeing in these burns is the gypsy moth were out during the leaf out period that we were burning, and they were dropping dead out of the canopy. So this area, probably in all likelihood, this is not a scientific result, it's an observed thing. We're seeing the gypsy moth actually being killed off in those early spring burns, and the predation by the gypsy moth on the sprouts going down a little bit. Now we still stress it with the resulting from the fire, but at least we knock back some of the introduced gypsy moth. The other thing that we're doing here, which can be achieved through the thinning, but also achieved through the fire alone or a combination of thinning and fire, is protecting these stands from southern pine beetles. And essentially they release a pheromone that brings in other pine beetles, and there's a point where the stand gets so thick that the wind can't blow through it, those closed woodlands that are a sign of where fire hasn't occurred. And if the wind can't blow those pheromones out of the stand, they attract a critical level of southern pine beetle based on the research they've done down south. And this is a concern because we do have southern pine beetles here on Cape Cod, but one of the best ways to protect forest against some of these introduced species is create a resiliency in them, invigorate those stands again, bring them back to the natural state, which is often a more open stand and more vigor. And as a result, it protects the forest and our general landscape from introduced species and other stressors on it that are not native. I think this is one reason why outreach programs to the public are extremely important, because what we see oftentimes is a misunderstanding of what happens in these pine barrens from the standpoint of habitat management. Oftentimes it's quite contrary to what you would normally perceive. People seeing heavy machinery coming in, cutting a forest, or us burning the forest, oftentimes view that as a negative impact, when actually I would turn the table and say that our not doing that is the greatest negative impact, because this is an early successional habitat, early successional forest. And as a case in point, I'll just talk about fire and the feasibility of doing it. Generally speaking, I've found in the 27 years I've been doing it, on average, the average year, you can get 30 good burn days. And when you start bringing in air quality issues, habitat regulatory issues, and other things like that, we've actually seen some of our sites restricted down to under 10 or 15 burn days that we have available. And that is what causing a scenario where it's very hard for us to get the habitat management done. And I think organizations coming together, creating landscape-wide endeavors and unification will also greatly help.
Heading out to eastern Massachusetts out in the Mid-Cape, we toured Wildcare, a non-profit organization that treats injured or ill native wildlife through rehabilitation. Stephanie Ellis, Executive Director of Wildcare, introduces us to the organization in the facility located just off of the Eastham Rotary.
This is Wildcare, and we are located on the Rotary in Eastham. And it's a great location because we're right off the Rotary and people can see where we are, and yet it's set back enough that we have a little bit of quiet here for the animals, which is really nice. We take in sick and injured and orphaned wild animals, and basically if you find an animal that's injured, you can bring it to us and we'll provide veterinary care. And our goal is always release. So this is a safe haven and an emergency room for wildlife. So our facility is a 19th century farmhouse, and as you will see, every square inch has been converted into animal care space. We utilize the space very well. Our seabird pool rooms are in the basement of our antique barn, and you'll see that we just built a mammal room where we keep small mammals, and we're hoping it will be a physical therapy room in the winter as well.
The first animal Stephanie showed us was an eastern box turtle named 45, who was the 45th animal to be brought into Wildcare in 2015. He was taken in and cared for after being inappropriately owned as a pet, which is illegal in Massachusetts.
Their populations are actually in decline. They're listed as a species of special concern, and that's because of habitat loss, being hit by cars, and ATVs unintentionally digging up their nests. So this turtle was brought to us, and it had been thrown out into the snow. It was being kept as a pet and then was tossed into the snow. And so we realized quickly that he is totally tame, too friendly to be back in the wild. So we applied for a permit for him. And he is our educational turtle. He's awesome.
Next, we were introduced to baby squirrels that had arrived just prior to our visiting. One was being nourished with a powdered milk formula to help it grow into a healthy adult. We were also introduced to a 3-week-old baby flying squirrel that was recovering after being found near a storm drain on a road. Moving alongside the squirrels, we were also introduced to the many birds that Wildcare holds, such as baby mourning doves, a baby house finch, and most majestic of all, eastern screech owls. Stepping outside of the main building, we learned the names of the many other species present at Wildcare and the outside aviaries.
My name is Kyle Daly, and I'm a volunteer here at Wildcare Cape Cod in Eastham, Massachusetts. Today we are feeding these chimney swifts. There were various little batches of these birds when they were dropped off here, found in chimneys on Cape Cod. Since their drop-off date, we have been feeding them a blend of mealworms, sometimes dipped in water so they can actually stay hydrated. These birds have very unique bodies, more so with their legs as they're unable to support them on branches. They have these sharp, spiny little claws that allows them to hang on to chimneys of various types. They're fascinating little birds. They migrate to Peru in the off-season, and they can eat thousands and thousands of insects per day, per bird, which is a huge incentive to anybody living by marsh areas. Notably, they have a very unique kind of scratchy, whiny chirp, and as you approach them to feed them, you get an abundance of them. So these little birds have been very fun to work with. It's awesome to experience the, helping of them and hopefully seeing them migrate off to Peru in the near future.
We next headed into the barn, where more varieties of baby birds were cared for until they can be released into the aviaries outside. But one of the best features of Wildcare can be found just below, where we meet Murray the Murr.
So this room is the best part of Wildcare. You can see we have a common murr in the pool. His nickname is Murray. We don't usually name our animals, but this bird is non-releasable, and he's actually flying to Omaha, Nebraska this week. He's going to be on permanent display in the Omaha Aquarium and Zoo. So we're very excited. He's going to be an educational bird for them. But the reason this room is so special is that we receive over 300 aquatic birds a year. And the most important thing in caring for aquatic birds is that they have to be waterproof. If you have a bird like this who spends its entire life at sea, literally only coming to land to breed, he has to be waterproof when you release him, or he will get hypothermic and he'll die. So these pools, we have a warm water pool and a cold water pool. But what happens is these birds, when they get into the water and they've been sick or injured, they don't preen their feathers, and so they're not waterproof. So the first thing that usually happens is they start sinking. And when they start sinking, they want to get out of the water because they're cold, they're wet. So do you see how Murray is on, we call it a haul out? It's a little platform that he can jump onto. So when birds are getting cold and wet, they immediately jump onto the platform and they start preening their feathers. And that's just what we want them to do, because they are redistributing the oils on their feathers and making themselves waterproof. Hi, Murray.
To wrap up, we head out to one of the largest aviaries present on Wildcare for bird rehabilitation.
This is the largest aviary in Massachusetts, and the reason it's so great is, I don't know if you can see, it forms an outer shell. So the outer portion of this aviary forms a continuous circle that birds can fly in, and so it's like a treadmill for hawks and owls, and we can actually put them on a training program where we force them to do laps, and that's a way we can determine if they are conditioned enough to be released back into the wild.
Stepping away from Cape Cod, we traveled up to Cambridge, Massachusetts, home to Mount Auburn Cemetery. To introduce us to the founder of this historic and ecological cemetery, we spoke to Corinne Alacone atop Washington Tower, a 62-foot structure that overlooks the entire cemetery, as well as the skyline of Boston, located 4 miles east.
Hi, I'm Corinne Alacone. I'm the Events and Outreach Coordinator here at Mount Auburn Cemetery. And right now we are standing atop Washington Tower in Mount Auburn Cemetery. And here you can really take in the view and just see how much land that Mount Auburn really covers. It's 175 acres and was founded in 1831. And its philosophy came from the old burial grounds in Boston, downtown Boston. By the early 1830s, they had become disease-ridden, dirty, not well taken care of, and people in Boston wanted something different. And so a bunch of amateur horticulturists came out to Cambridge, which was rural back in the early 1800s. They bought all of this land and they decided to make it a place that was going to be beautiful, that was going to comfort mourners in the solace of nature. The garden cemetery movement was really the beginning of the public parks movement, because before the garden cemetery movement, there was not really a place where people could go and just be in nature, walk around, and enjoy a public space.
We next spoke to Candace Curry, Director of Planning and Sustainability at Mount Auburn. She discusses about green burials, an important part that makes up the cemetery. Green burials is described as a deceased person being placed into the ground and being decomposed naturally, which includes the body, casket, and clothing. Rather than using traditional methods of burying people at cemeteries, Candace hopes to encourage the use of green burials as a safe way to conserve space in the environment while allowing bodies to decompose naturally and become a part of a thriving environment around them.
Hello, I'm Candace Curry, and I'm here at Mount Auburn Cemetery. Mount Auburn Cemetery is 175 acres of wooded, beautiful land. It's an arboretum. It has 3 ponds and 1 vernal pool. And I happen to be standing in what's known as the meadow, or the last 3 acres of undeveloped land at Mount Auburn Cemetery. At the moment, we've let this area go natural. We have an apiary here with 4 or 5 beehives, and we've had wild turkeys recently that have been eating some of the vegetation. And this area is not yet burial ground. I wanted to show this area as a potential place and a potential look of a natural burial ground. That would be a meadow where a 3.5-foot hole could be dug and a body could simply go into the grave. I could wrap myself in a shroud or a sheet or a wooden casket, a plain pine box, or even a papier-mâché casket. Something that would allow the body to naturally decompose. It's an area like this where those natural burials could happen, in a meadow. It might be near a tree, it might be at the edge of a forest, but it's a location that would naturally allow the body to decompose and become part of nature. So we're now in the center of Mount Auburn Cemetery. This is part of the original 72 acres of the 175 acres that Mount Auburn comprises. And we have a lot of marble monuments, some old granite monuments, some old brownstones, and this is where the natural burials probably really did happen. Now we know many people still like to have a marker. What we allow at Mount Auburn is perhaps a tree memorial, either a new tree or an existing tree. But that's what comprises green burial at Mount Auburn Cemetery. So you're in already an historic section, and you're near other green burials that occurred perhaps 100 years ago. And that's what makes green burial at Mount Auburn. Mount Auburn started also, even before 1831 when it was founded, a man named George Brimmer purchased 72 acres of land because he wanted to conserve it, keep it away from development. He saw all around Watertown and Cambridge development was going on, and he said, this is beautiful space, I want to keep this as conservation land. Well, a few years later, the founders of Mount Auburn Cemetery went to George Brimmer and said, what do you think about this idea of a garden cemetery? He agreed it was a perfect way to marry his sense of conservation with a burial ground. And that's why we have now, over 180 years later, Mount Auburn Cemetery. It's still a luscious, preserved area that's using burials as a way to conserve the land, and it's still working. I'm standing at the edge of Consecration Dell, which is a vernal pool within Mount Auburn Cemetery. In 1831, it's the location where 2,000 people from Boston walked or took a horse and carriage to this location in a September morning for special prayers and to help make this land sacred as a cemetery. It was a garden burial location, the first of its kind in the nation, and it became the precursor to the public park system. And to this day, I continue to think of this area as very sacred, for not only do we have a burial ground, we also have a breeding grounds for the spotted salamander. We've also reintroduced species, gray tree frogs, spring peepers, and turtles. And now when you come to the cemetery, you can actually hear loud ribbiting and fabulous creatures walking through the forest floor. So this is a very sacred space indeed. And although we still have an active burial ground here at Mount Auburn, we don't allow new sales of burials in this location. It is a conservation area within the cemetery.
In hopes of carrying out Candace's vision on expanding green burials into southeastern Massachusetts, Denise Stowell, representing the Southeastern Massachusetts Pine Barrens Alliance, expresses hopes of converting a wooded area into a green burial site. This area is located off of Route 80 in Plymouth.
Hi, I'm Denise Stowell. Our major goal in the Alliance is to try to protect more land. We're here in Plymouth on land that the town owns. So I'm hoping the next burial site that the town of Plymouth, which is hopefully here, will be have a large portion of natural habitat where one's body would be allowed to decompose naturally into the earth and just also provide a natural park-like setting for people to come and visit their loved ones when they are on to another world. So this is another view of the land the town owns that they are proposing for a cemetery where we're hoping a large part of that will be a green cemetery. There seems to be a lot of interest in a new type of more natural burial. The land here is pretty pristine and untouched, and I think it's a great opportunity to provide an area like this that the town will always have. It seems to be the vision that has kept a lot of our parks alive, and people enjoy having a little bit of nature in their lives.
To wrap up our film, We step outside the boundaries of southeastern Massachusetts in the Cape by heading over to the island of Nantucket. Having around 11,000 people inhabit a 105 square mile island, local environmental organizations work to keep a balanced ecosystem in order to support a popular tourist destination in the summer months. We first spoke to Noah Carberg, Assistant Airport Manager for the Nantucket Memorial Airport, on how the airport manages the 1,200 acres of land that make up over 15% of the island's area.
Hi, Noah Carberg. We're here at Nantucket Memorial Airport. This area is what we call the Runway 24 approach, and it's one of our permitted rare species grasslands. This area was, frankly, it was an accident of management. In the 1940s, it started out as a sandplain grassland. As with much of the island, it seceded to a scrub oak shrubland until the 1980s when airport staff reclaimed it, and they did this through a process I call management by brute force. They came in with grapples and loaders and bulldozers, pulled the scrub oak out by the roots, regraded everything, and continued to mow it several times a year, well into the late 1990s. Starting in the early 2000s, when we had to permit some airfield improvements, we worked under the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act to turn this into a better quality grassland. We moved to dormant season mowing, and it came back in a really beneficial ecotone. One of the plants that's out here in abundance now at my feet is New England blazing star. Being on the island, we're a little behind the mainland, but this turns into a showy purple flower. This is one clump of a couple dozen plants. You can find these throughout the airfield, along with sandplain blue-eyed grass, sandplain flax, Papalos nutsedge, and lion's foot. We're standing next to the runway 624. This was an area that was a mixed pitch pine scrub oak stand that hadn't been managed in 30 years until 3.5 years ago. We mowed everything down, and we've done a couple annual mowings since. This is mainly done for safety-related issues, being as close as we are to the runway. When this area came back in vegetation, we had a lot of clumps of viburnum, and growing through the viburnum and adjacent to it is lion's foot, Natalis serpentaria, which is rare on Nantucket even, and getting extremely rare in Massachusetts. One of the features of the airport and our security fence is that it excludes, or mostly excludes, white-tailed deer, which will go to town on this plant. In the absence of deer and following our management, we've had a lot of areas come back with really robust populations of lion's foot. So one of the outcomes that we've learned from the management that facilitates this plant and others like it is that public safety and rare species can coexist if everybody works together really hard on those goals. So we're in a different area of the airport. We call this the ASR area. It surrounds our airport surveillance radar. It's about 170 acres, and it's an area we had an ongoing challenge with, both in terms of meeting our MESA permit and in meeting our wildlife goals. The management we originally initiated under our permit didn't quite do the adequate job of opening the area up and benefiting the Lepidoptera community that we were targeting. One of the first things we did that you can see behind me was that we did some large-scale mowing. This area is a lot different than the preceding habitat, which has been overgrown for 30 years. This mowing is probably 2.5, 3 years old, and we're going to follow it up with some finer resolution mowing where we're targeting 50 to 80% of the scrub oak while leaving the remaining heath community. This not only opens it up visually, but you can imagine if you're trying to find wildlife such as a deer in here, it can be done. You can meet your public safety goals, and it's also a better solution for the Lepidoptera community. It opens it up, it provides for more diversity, and it provides for the younger scrub oak that a lot more beneficial to the obligate scrub oak feeders.
Also featured on the island is the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, the island's largest landowner that owns about a third of the total area of Nantucket. Beginning with Karen Beatty, the Science and Stewardship Department Manager, we hear about what the conservation group is doing in order to manage shrublands that are located just outside of some people's doorsteps.
So we're in the Middle Moors, which is a large contiguous property owned by the Nantucket Conservation Foundation in the center of the island, and there's about 4,000 acres of contiguous property that's been protected by the foundation and the land bank and several other conservation groups. And we have kind of the whole spectrum here of habitats from grasslands to heathlands to scrub oak barrens to pitch pine barrens. And one of the goals of our organization is to try to manage all of these different areas to maintain that mosaic. And one of the recent initiatives that we've undertaken as an organization is to try to dovetail the management work that we're doing with providing a little bit of safety for the residents that own homes along the edges of our property. As you can see in the background, there's a number of homes that border our property, and as I'm sure most people know, this type of vegetation is extremely flammable. It's fire dependent. So if a wildfire were ever to get going in this area, it would be pretty dramatic and it would be a pretty big public safety hazard. This particular area that we're looking at right now was first mowed in 2013, and we mow it twice a year to try to keep the vegetation down. And the idea is that we're trying to promote and restore grassland habitat in this area, but we're also trying to provide a safe zone for the fire department if they were ever to need to get in here to do fire suppression or to defend some of the homes that border our properties over here. We have a whole suite of passer and birds that you would expect to see in shrublands and grasslands in these areas.
Lastly, Danielle Odell introduces us to what the organization is doing to monitor many species of bats that may migrate to and from the island throughout the year.
Hi, I'm Danielle Odell. I am an ecologist and field supervisor at the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, and I am here to talk about northern long-eared bats on Nantucket. We did not know that we had this species on the island until 2015. We started working with a graduate student, Zara Dowling, at the UMass Amherst campus, and she was looking at the effects of offshore wind energy on migratory bats, and she came out and put a few passive detectors across the island looking to see if we might have northern long-eared bats. They were never known to be here, but we took a shot in the dark and actually ended up picking up not only northern long-eareds, but about 5 other species too. Some that we didn't think we had any species that were actually resident bats on Nantucket. We thought they were all just maybe migrating through in the spring and the fall. But it turns out that we actually have a few species that are sticking around here pretty much all through the summer, and that leads us to believe that they're breeding here, including the northern long-eared bats, which are of special interest to us because they are listed as endangered at the state level and threatened at the federal level. So we put up nets and we caught a whole bunch of northern long-eared bats, and we found that not only were they here, but that they were breeding here. We were catching not only juveniles, but lactating adult females. So our next question is really to find out, are they exposed to white nose syndrome here? And if they are they surviving it? And are they hibernating here? We're really pushing now to find hibernacula on Nantucket. Anywhere there's pitch pine forests, we're catching northern long-eared bats, which is really just interesting. We tracked several bats to maternity roosts that were all in pitch pines. This summer we had 18 bats emerge from one roost, which is a lot of bats for the northern long-eareds. And they seem to really prefer these dense old stands of pitch pine. Lots of snags. Snags seem to be very important. They also will get underneath old flaking pieces of bark. And then dense understory. They like the really shrubby understory with big tall pitch pines. So we're definitely finding that these pitch pine barrens are very, very important on the island for northern long-eared bats.
As we traveled across the coastline of Massachusetts, from the beaches and forests of Plymouth, across the Cape Cod Canal through the forests of pitch pine, and onto the historic island of Nantucket, there was one concept in common with the 15 groups we interviewed: conserving and protecting the unique pine barrens of this region. We saw this being done in many different ways, from the conservation of forests in eco-sensitive areas, caring for ill and injured wildlife, promoting green burial, and educating the community on the sights and sounds of nature. The hard and determined work done by these individuals is especially important in a time where we live in a world affected by climate change. Raising awareness of the various environmental organizations to the public can hopefully convince many to truly appreciate the natural beauty that our planet holds, both in its landscapes and its wondrous wildlife. Our actions will continue to transform the mechanisms of Earth, and it's our choice to make them negative or positive.